In October 1962, the world appeared calm. There were no visible signs of war, no emergency broadcasts, no mass evacuations, no public awareness that humanity was approaching the most dangerous moment in its history. Daily life continued uninterrupted. Governments functioned as usual. Cities remained quiet. And yet, behind closed doors, a small group of men were making decisions that could determine whether civilization itself would survive. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not begin in October 1962. It was not a sudden confrontation, nor a single miscalculation. It was a result of years of tension, fear, mistrust, and strategic imbalance that had been steadily building since the end of the Second World War. To understand how the world came so close to nuclear annihilation, it is necessary to understand the world that existed before the crisis, how power was distributed, how fear shaped policy, and how nuclear weapons transformed global politics forever. The Second World War ended in 1945, but peace did not follow in the way many had hoped. Europe lay in ruins, its cities destroyed and its populations exhausted. Millions were dead, economies were shattered, and old empires were collapsing. Yet the most profound change did not come from the devastation of Europe, but from two unprecedented events in Japan. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time in human history, a single weapon demonstrated the ability to destroy an entire city in seconds. With these bombings, humanity entered the nuclear age. Warfare was transformed permanently. From that moment on, war was no longer merely about winning or losing. It was about survival itself. The existence of nuclear weapons meant that a future global conflict could end not with treaties or borders redrawn, but with civilization erased. This reality would dominate international politics for decades to come. Out of the destruction of the Second World War, two nations emerged as global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought together against Nazi Germany, but their alliance had been built on necessity, not trust. Once their common enemy was defeated, the ideological differences between them became impossible to ignore. The United States represented a system based on capitalism, liberal democracy, and open markets. The Soviet Union represented centralized authority, one-party rule, and communist ideology. Each side believed its system was superior. More importantly, each side believed that the global spread of the other represented an existential threat. This rivalry did not result in direct war between the two powers. Instead, it evolved into what became known as the Cold War, a global struggle fought through political pressure, military alliances, proxy wars, espionage, and, above all, nuclear deterrence. The absence of direct combat did not mean peace. It meant something more unstable, a state of permanent tension, in which every decision carried the risk of catastrophic escalation. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. Over time, these weapons became more powerful, more numerous, and easier to deliver. Strategic bombers, ballistic missiles, and eventually submarines capable of launching nuclear weapons from beneath the oceans became central to military planning. Each year, arsenals expanded. Each year, the potential for destruction increased. The logic that governed this era was brutal but simple. If both sides possessed the ability to destroy each other completely, neither would dare to strike first. This doctrine became known as mutually assured destruction. Peace was maintained not through trust or cooperation, but through fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of extinction, fear that any misstep could end the world. However, deterrence depended on balance, and that balance was not equal. Throughout the 1950s, the United States maintained a clear strategic advantage in nuclear capabilities. It possessed a larger arsenal, more reliable delivery systems, and a global network of military bases. Most importantly, American nuclear weapons were stationed close to Soviet territory. Missiles were deployed in Western Europe, and some of the most threatening were stationed in Turkey. These Jupiter missiles were capable of striking Soviet cities within minutes. From the perspective of the Soviet leadership, this was an unacceptable situation. The Soviet Union had no equivalent weapons positioned near American soil. Moscow was vulnerable. Washington was not. This imbalance deeply influenced Soviet strategic thinking. Nikita Khrushchev, who rose to power after the death of Joseph Stalin, was determined to change this situation. He believed the Soviet Union needed a bold and decisive move, one that would restore balance and demonstrate Soviet strength on the global stage. At the same time, the Cold War was expanding far beyond Europe. What had begun as a rivalry between two superpowers was becoming a global confrontation. Conflicts in Korea, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America were increasingly shaped by the interests of Washington and Moscow. Revolutions were no longer local events. They were interpreted as victories or defeats in a worldwide ideological struggle. Nowhere would this dynamic become more dangerous than in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the United States had considered Latin America its sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine had long asserted that external powers should not interfere in the affairs of the Americas. Cuba, located less than 100 miles from Florida, had been firmly within this sphere. American businesses dominated large sectors of the Cuban economy, and Washington supported friendly governments that protected U.S. interests. This relationship collapsed in 1959. A revolutionary movement led by Fidel Castro overthrew the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Initially, Castro's revolution was nationalist rather than openly communist, but it was deeply anti-imperialist. The new government moved quickly to implement land reforms and nationalize foreign-owned industries, many of them American. The United States responded with economic sanctions and political pressure. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly. Facing isolation and hostility from Washington, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. Moscow saw an opportunity unlike any it had encountered before. For the first time, the Soviet Union had a potential ally in the Western Hemisphere, just miles from American territory. What began as a regional revolution quickly became a critical front in the Cold War. The situation escalated dramatically in April 1961. Determined to remove Castro from power, the United States approved a covert operation to overthrow the Cuban government. The plan involved a force of Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, landing on the island and sparking a popular uprising. The operation became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a complete failure. The invasion force was quickly defeated by Cuban troops. No uprising occurred. The operation exposed direct American involvement and humiliated the newly elected U.S. President, John F. Kennedy. For Fidel Castro, the lesson was clear. The United States would not tolerate his government. Another invasion was only a matter of time. For the Soviet Union, the lesson was equally clear. Cuba was vulnerable, and if Castro's government were to survive, it needed protection, not symbolic support, not political statements, but a guarantee strong enough to deter American military action. That guarantee could only be nuclear weapons. This realization would set the world on a path toward confrontation, a path that, within less than 2 years, would bring humanity closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before. And at the center of that path stood a small Caribbean island, about to become the most dangerous place on Earth. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the strategic landscape changed permanently. For Fidel Castro, the invasion confirmed what he had already suspected. The United States would never accept a revolutionary government in Cuba. His survival, and the survival of his regime, now depended on preventing another American attack. For the Soviet Union, the lesson was equally clear. If Cuba were to remain a socialist ally in the Western Hemisphere, it had to be defended in a way that made invasion unthinkable. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev began to consider options that went far beyond conventional military support. Economic aid and advisors were not enough. Cuban air defenses were limited. The Cuban army, though loyal and motivated, could not repel a full-scale American invasion. What Cuba needed was a deterrent so powerful that Washington would be forced to think twice before acting. That deterrent was nuclear weapons. For Khrushchev, the idea was radical, but also logical. The United States had already placed nuclear missiles close to Soviet borders. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy could reach Soviet territory within minutes. From the Kremlin's perspective, this was a constant threat, one that left little warning time in the event of an attack. Placing Soviet missiles in Cuba would not only protect the island, it would also restore strategic balance by creating a similar threat to the United States. Khrushchev believed that if American leaders understood that their own cities were directly vulnerable, they would behave more cautiously. Nuclear missiles in Cuba would serve as both a shield for Castro and a bargaining chip in the broader Cold War rivalry. By early 1962, the decision was made. The operation would be conducted in absolute secrecy. Soviet planners understood that if the United States discovered the missiles before they were operational, the consequences could be severe. American military doctrine allowed for preemptive action. The presence of nuclear weapons so close to U.S. territory could provoke an immediate response. Surprise was essential. The operation was given a code name, Operation Anida. Even within the Soviet military, knowledge of the plan was tightly restricted. Many officers involved were told they were being sent to the Arctic, not the Caribbean. Tropical clothing was issued only at the last moment. Missiles, launch equipment, and nuclear warheads were transported under the guise of agricultural machinery and industrial supplies. Throughout the summer of 1962, Soviet cargo ships crossed the Atlantic. Their decks were often covered to conceal their contents. At night, equipment was unloaded in Cuban ports. Soviet soldiers, engineers, and technicians arrived in increasing numbers. By the end of the summer, tens of thousands of Soviet personnel were on the island. Construction began almost immediately. Missile sites were established in remote areas, hidden among forests and farmland. Concrete launch pads were poured. Support facilities were built. Medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were assembled piece by piece. Once operational, these missiles would be able to strike Washington, New York, and much of the eastern United States. At the same time, Soviet air defense systems were installed across Cuba. Surface-to-air missiles were positioned to protect the missile sites from aerial attack. The goal was clear: create a layered defense that would make it extremely difficult for the United States to eliminate the missiles once they were in place. From Moscow's perspective, the plan was progressing successfully. From Washington's perspective, almost nothing was known. American intelligence was aware that Soviet military aid to Cuba had increased. Reports indicated the presence of new weapons and personnel. But there was no confirmation of nuclear missiles. Some analysts believed Khrushchev would never take such a risky step. Others warned that the Soviet leader might be willing to gamble. President John F. Kennedy found himself navigating a narrow path. He was under pressure from military leaders who advocated a hard line against Cuba. At the same time, he was determined to avoid actions that could lead to direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. The memory of the Bay of Pigs was still fresh. Kennedy was cautious, aware that misjudgment could have devastating consequences. Publicly, the administration maintained a firm stance against Cuba. Privately, it struggled to assess the true scale of the Soviet presence on the island. Throughout the summer, American reconnaissance flights over Cuba continued. High-altitude U-2 aircraft photographed military installations, ports, and airfields. The images revealed new construction, but nothing that conclusively proved the presence of nuclear missiles. Some analysts interpreted the activity as defensive. Others suspected something more dangerous was underway. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro grew increasingly convinced that another American invasion was imminent. Cuban intelligence reported increased U.S. military exercises in the region. American rhetoric toward Cuba remained hostile. Castro urged the Soviets to accelerate their efforts. The faster the missiles became operational, the safer Cuba would be. By September 1962, the situation was becoming more tense. The United States publicly warned the Soviet Union against introducing offensive weapons into Cuba. Kennedy issued statements declaring that such a move would not be tolerated. Khrushchev, in turn, assured Washington that Soviet assistance to Cuba was purely defensive. These assurances were false. Behind the scenes, missile sites were nearing completion. The final phase of the operation involved assembling the nuclear warheads themselves. These warheads were under strict Soviet control. Local commanders did not have the authority to use them without direct orders from Moscow. Nevertheless, their mere presence dramatically increased the stakes. A single misunderstanding or unauthorized action could trigger a chain reaction leading to nuclear war. As September turned into October, the window of secrecy began to close. Missile sites were becoming harder to conceal. Construction accelerated. Equipment was moved into position during daylight hours. Camouflage nets were used, but they were imperfect. The longer the operation continued, the greater the risk of discovery. In Washington, pressure mounted to obtain clear intelligence. Reconnaissance flights were intensified. Some officials argued for low-altitude flights that could provide more detailed imagery, despite the increased risk to pilots. The decision to authorize such flights would prove decisive. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew over western Cuba. As it passed over a region near San Cristobal, its cameras captured a series of photographs. When the images were developed and analyzed, they revealed unmistakable evidence: long cylindrical objects, launch pads, support vehicles. There was no longer any doubt. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. When the photographs reached the White House, the mood changed instantly. What had been speculation became reality. The strategic balance of the Cold War had shifted overnight. The United States now faced nuclear weapons positioned just minutes away from its cities. President Kennedy was informed on the morning of October 16th. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. The world, still unaware, continued its daily routine. But the clock was now ticking. On the morning of October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was informed of what American reconnaissance aircraft had discovered over Cuba. The photographs were clear. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed on the island. For the first time in history, a hostile nuclear power had placed offensive nuclear weapons within immediate striking distance of the United States. Kennedy understood the gravity of the moment instantly. These missiles fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. Once operational, they could reach Washington, New York, and much of the eastern United States in a matter of minutes. The traditional warning time that underpinned nuclear deterrence would be reduced to almost nothing. The discovery created a crisis unlike any before it. Kennedy did not announce the findings to the public. He did not inform America's allies. Instead, he moved quietly. The president knew that any premature reaction could escalate the situation beyond control. What followed would be the most intense and consequential deliberations of his presidency. Within hours, Kennedy convened a small group of senior officials and advisors. This group would later become known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. It included the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, military commanders, intelligence officials, and close political advisors. The discussions that took place within EXCOM were raw, tense, and often deeply divided. At the heart of the debate was a single, terrifying question. How should the United States respond? One option was immediate military action. Some military leaders argued for a full-scale airstrike to destroy the missile sites, followed by an invasion of Cuba. From their perspective, the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons so close to American territory was unacceptable. Eliminating the threat quickly and decisively seemed the safest course of action. But this option carried enormous risks. An airstrike might fail to destroy all the missiles. Some could survive and be launched in retaliation. An invasion would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel stationed on the island. Such an attack could force the Soviet Union to respond elsewhere, most likely in Berlin, where Western access to the city was already precarious. Another option was diplomacy. Some advisors argued for direct negotiations with Moscow, seeking a peaceful resolution before the situation spiraled out of control. However, this approach was seen as slow and uncertain. Every day that passed brought the missiles closer to full operational readiness. A third option emerged as a compromise, a naval blockade. The idea was to prevent further Soviet military shipments from reaching Cuba while giving Moscow time to reconsider its actions. The term blockade, however, was deliberately avoided. Under international law, a blockade could be considered an act of war. Instead, the administration adopted the term quarantine, framing it as a defensive measure. Kennedy listened. He questioned. He challenged assumptions. He was acutely aware that every option carried the risk of nuclear war. The atmosphere inside the White House was heavy with uncertainty. EXCOM meetings stretched for hours. Arguments flared. Military leaders pressed for decisive action. Civilian advisors urged caution. Intelligence assessments were incomplete. No one knew how close the missiles were to becoming operational. Above all, there was one overwhelming fear: escalation. Kennedy understood that once American forces attacked Soviet assets, control over events could be lost. The Cold War had always been governed by indirect confrontation. Cuba threatened to shatter that pattern. While these debates unfolded in Washington, the rest of the world remained unaware. There were no public warnings, no emergency measures. The crisis was unfolding in secrecy. On October 18th, Kennedy met with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko at the White House. During the meeting, Gromyko assured the president that Soviet assistance to Cuba was purely defensive. He denied the presence of offensive weapons on the island. Kennedy listened without revealing what he already knew. The deception confirmed the administration's worst fears. The Soviet Union was willing to lie openly at the highest diplomatic level. Trust was evaporating. Inside XCOM, the sense of urgency intensified. Time was running out. If the missiles became operational, the United States would face a permanent and unacceptable threat. The president needed to act, but not recklessly. By October 20th, Kennedy reached a decision. The United States would impose a naval quarantine around Cuba. American naval forces would intercept and inspect ships bound for the island. Any vessel carrying offensive military equipment would be turned back. At the same time, Kennedy would address the nation and the world, revealing the existence of the missiles and making America's position unmistakably clear. This approach was risky, but it offered a chance to control the pace of escalation. It signaled resolve without immediate violence. It also placed the burden of the next move on the Soviet Union. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy delivered a televised address to the American people. For the first time, the world learned of the missiles in Cuba. Kennedy spoke calmly, but the message was unmistakable. The United States would not tolerate offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Any missile launched from the island would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring full retaliation. The speech sent shockwaves around the globe. Markets trembled. Governments scrambled to assess the situation. Ordinary people, suddenly aware of the danger, confronted the possibility of nuclear war. At sea, American naval forces moved into position. The quarantine line was established hundreds of miles from Cuba. Soviet ships continued their approach. The world now watched as two nuclear superpowers move closer to direct confrontation. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced his own dilemma. Backing down could be seen as weakness. Pressing forward risked war. The Soviet leader had hoped to install the missile quietly and negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, the operation had been exposed. Messages began to flow between Washington and Moscow, some formal, some informal, some public, some secret. Each carried the weight of potential catastrophe. As Soviet ships neared the quarantine line, American commanders prepared to stop them. Orders were issued. Rules of engagement were clarified. The margin for error was razor thin. A single miscalculation, a single shot fired in confusion, a single misunderstood command. Any of these could trigger a chain reaction that no one could stop. The Cold War had reached its most dangerous phase, and the most perilous days were still ahead. The announcement of a naval quarantine marked a decisive turning point. What had previously been a secret confrontation between governments was now an open global crisis. For the first time, the world fully understood how close it stood to nuclear war. Yet understanding did not bring clarity. It brought fear. American naval forces moved swiftly into position across the Caribbean. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and patrol planes formed a wide arc around Cuba. The quarantine line was drawn hundreds of miles from the island, and orders were clear. Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons were not to pass. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a physical barrier backed by force. At the same time, American military readiness increased worldwide. Strategic Air Command went to heightened alert. Nuclear bombers were dispersed to reduce vulnerability. Missile crews were placed on standby. The United States was preparing for the possibility that deterrence might fail. In Moscow, the situation was equally tense. Nikita Khrushchev now faced a decision with enormous consequences. The Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line carried more than supplies. They carried the credibility of Soviet power and leadership. Turning them back would be seen by some as a humiliating retreat, allowing them to continue risk direct confrontation with the United States Navy. Khrushchev had not intended to provoke a public crisis. His plan had relied on secrecy and speed. The missiles were meant to be operational before Washington could react. Instead, exposure had forced a confrontation under the worst possible conditions. As Soviet ships advanced across the Atlantic, the world waited. In Washington, the XCOM meetings grew more intense. The quarantine was in effect, but no one knew how the Soviet Union would respond. Would Soviet captains obey orders to turn back? Would they challenge the American blockade? Would Moscow escalate elsewhere, perhaps in Berlin? The uncertainty was suffocating. President Kennedy understood that once American ships physically stopped Soviet vessels, control over events could slip away. Naval confrontations were unpredictable. A misinterpreted signal, a nervous commander, or a technical malfunction could trigger violence. Despite these risks, Kennedy believed the quarantine was the least dangerous option available. It allowed time for communication, time for reflection, time for diplomacy. But time itself was dangerous. Each passing day brought the Cuban missile sites closer to full operational readiness. Even as ships were stopped at sea, missiles already on the island could soon be capable of launch. On October 24th, the first major test arrived. Several Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American naval forces tracked them closely. Aircraft flew overhead. Sonar systems monitored submarines below the surface. The tension was palpable. Then, just short of a line, the Soviet ships slowed. Some stopped, others turned around. For the moment, confrontation was avoided. This pause did not end the crisis. It merely shifted its center of gravity. The danger had moved from the open sea to the island of Cuba itself. Inside Cuba, construction at missile sites continued. Soviet technicians worked urgently to complete installations. Surface-to-air missile systems were fully operational. Cuban and Soviet forces were on high alert. American reconnaissance flights intensified. Low-altitude aircraft flew directly over missile sites, gathering detailed imagery. These missions were extremely dangerous. Pilots knew they could be shot down at any moment. Each flight increased the risk of escalation. Within XCOM, debate resumed with renewed urgency. The quarantine had bought time, but it had not solved the problem. The missiles remained in Cuba. If they became operational, the United States would face a permanent nuclear threat. Some military leaders renewed their call for airstrikes. Others argued that delay only strengthened the Soviet position. Civilian advisors warned that an attack could trigger nuclear retaliation. Kennedy listened, weighing every argument. Meanwhile, communication between Washington and Moscow intensified. Khrushchev sent messages, some conciliatory, others defiant. His tone shifted from day to day, reflecting the uncertainty within the Soviet leadership itself. Publicly, Khrushchev condemned the quarantine as an act of aggression. Privately, he searched for a way out. The crisis reached a new level of danger on October 26. A long, emotional message arrived from Khrushchev to Kennedy. It was personal in tone, almost desperate. Khrushchev appealed to reason, warning of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. He suggested a possible compromise. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. The message was not an official diplomatic note. It read like a man speaking directly to another man, aware of the abyss beneath them. Kennedy and his advisors saw an opportunity. But before a response could be finalized, a second message arrived the following day. This one was very different. The new message was harsher, more formal, and included an additional demand: the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Now the situation was even more complex. Accepting the deal publicly would expose American concessions and potentially weaken NATO. Rejecting it outright risked pushing Khrushchev into a corner. Before a decision could be made, events on the ground took a terrifying turn. On October 27th, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was killed. This was the first direct combat fatality of the crisis. In Washington, alarm spread instantly. Military leaders urged immediate retaliation. Plans were drawn up for airstrikes within hours. The pressure on Kennedy was immense. At the same time, another U-2 aircraft accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near the Arctic. Soviet interceptors scrambled. For several minutes, the situation threatened to spiral completely out of control. These incidents revealed how fragile the situation had become. Control was slipping away, not because of deliberate decisions, but because of chance. Few people knew how close the world now stood to nuclear war. Even fewer knew that the most dangerous moment of the crisis was unfolding beneath the surface of the ocean. Soviet submarines, armed with nuclear torpedoes, were operating near the quarantine line. American naval forces, unaware of the nuclear weapons aboard, used depth charges to force the submarines to surface. Inside one submarine, temperatures soared. Communication with Moscow was lost. Officers debated whether war had already begun. The authority to launch a nuclear torpedo required agreement among 3 officers. 2 were prepared to proceed. The third refused. That decision, made in isolation, under unimaginable pressure, may have saved the world. Back in Washington, Kennedy faced his final and most difficult choice. The situation could no longer be allowed to drift. Delay increased the risk of accidental war. Action risked deliberate escalation. The president decided to respond to Khrushchev's first message, ignoring the second, more aggressive one. The United States would publicly agree not to invade Cuba. Privately, it would also agree to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. The response was sent. Now, all that remained was to see whether it would be accepted. The fate of the world rested on a reply. The response from Washington crossed the Atlantic in silence. There was no public announcement, no guarantee that it would succeed. President Kennedy had chosen a narrow and risky path. By replying only to Khrushchev's first message, he deliberately ignored the more aggressive demand for public trade involving American missiles in Turkey. The decision was calculated. Kennedy believed that Khrushchev was searching for a way out of the crisis, one that would allow him to retreat without humiliation. Now, the outcome depended entirely on how the Soviet leader would interpret the message. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev faced immense pressure. The crisis had escalated far beyond his original intentions. What he had envisioned as a bold strategic move had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Soviet forces were on high alert. American forces were on high alert. One misstep could trigger irreversible destruction. Khrushchev understood something crucial. Escalation no longer guaranteed control. The Soviet Union could not be certain that a conflict would remain limited. Any exchange, even a conventional one, could rapidly turn nuclear. And once nuclear weapons were used, no leader could predict the outcome. The message from Kennedy offered a way out. Publicly, it allowed the Soviet Union to claim a victory, a formal American pledge not to invade Cuba. This addressed the primary concern of Fidel Castro and justified Soviet intervention on the island. Privately, the promise to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey restored strategic balance, without exposing NATO or embarrassing Washington. For Khrushchev, It was enough. On October 28, 1962, Radio Moscow broadcast a statement from the Soviet leader. In it, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union had agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba. The crisis, he declared, would be resolved peacefully. The world exhaled. There were no celebrations, no triumphal speeches, only relief. American reconnaissance soon confirmed that missile sites in Cuba were being dismantled. Launchers were taken apart. Warheads were removed. Soviet ships carried the missiles back across the Atlantic under international observation. The immediate danger had passed. But the Cuban Missile Crisis did not end cleanly or comfortably. For Fidel Castro, the resolution was deeply unsettling. He had not been consulted during the final negotiations. The fate of his country had been decided by two superpowers acting in their own interests. Although Cuba remained protected from invasion, Castro felt betrayed and marginalized. The crisis reinforces distrust of both Washington and Moscow. For the United States, the outcome was publicly framed as a firm stand against Soviet aggression. Kennedy's approval ratings rose. His restraint was praised. Yet behind the scenes, the administration understood how close the situation had come to catastrophe. The margin between survival and annihilation had been alarmingly thin. For the Soviet Union, the crisis was a sobering experience. Khrushchev had avoided nuclear war, but his gamble had failed. The missiles were removed. The secrecy had collapsed. Within the Soviet leadership, confidence in his judgment was shaken. 2 years later, Khrushchev would be removed from power. Perhaps the most important legacy of the crisis was psychological. Both sides had stared into the abyss and recoiled. In the months that followed, concrete steps were taken to reduce the risk of future catastrophe. A direct communication link, the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow, allowing leaders to communicate instantly in times of crisis. Arms control negotiations gained momentum. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963, limiting atmospheric nuclear testing. The Cold War did not end, but it changed. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that nuclear war was not an abstract concept. It was not a theoretical possibility. It was a real and immediate danger that could arise from miscalculation, miscommunication, or accident. The crisis also revealed how little control leaders truly had once events were set in motion. Decisions made thousands of miles away nearly triggered nuclear launches by submarine commanders cut off from communication. Individual choices, often made in isolation, proved as important as grand strategy. History would later reveal just how close the world had come to destruction. American leaders did not know that Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. Soviet leaders did not know how far American forces were prepared to go. Each side acted on incomplete information, guided by fear as much as reason. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not resolved by strength alone. It was resolved by restraint, by leaders willing to step back, to compromise, to accept imperfect solutions. In October 1962, humanity survived not because war was impossible, but because, at the final moment, it was avoided. The nuclear age had revealed its true nature. From that point forward, the survival of civilization would depend not only on weapons and deterrence, but on judgment, communication, and the willingness to stop before it was too late. The world would never again be so unaware of how close it could come to ending itself. And perhaps that awareness was the crisis's most enduring legacy.